which allows us to take a lot of the funding and resources that we have access to and put more agents in.
Stop. Did you just hear that? The Drug Enforcement Administration, America's most powerful federal law enforcement agency, is now opening permanent offices inside Canada. Not at the border, inside Canada. Let that sink in for 1 second, because what that actually means is that the United States government has officially decided that Canada can no longer be trusted to police itself. And here's the thing, they're not wrong. I'm going to show you today exactly how Canada went from being America's most stable, trusted neighbor to a country where foreign law enforcement agencies feel the need to set up shop inside its own borders. And I'm going to show you that almost all roads lead back to one man, a man who was a central banker in England, then a climate finance architect at the United Nations, then the chairman of a global financial coalition worth $130 trillion. And who is now, somehow, the Prime Minister of Canada. His name is Mark Carney. And what you're about to learn about him is something the mainstream media has almost entirely refused to cover. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. Before he ever put his name on a ballot, Mark Carney had already spent decades reshaping the global financial system. Not as a politician, but as something arguably far more powerful. From 2008 to 2013, he was governor of the Bank of Canada. Then from 2013 to 2020, he became governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British person ever appointed to that role. But his most consequential work happened outside those central banks. In September 2015, just months before the Paris Climate Agreement, Carney delivered what many financial historians now consider the most influential speech in modern banking history. It was called Breaking the Tragedy of the Horizon, delivered to Lloyd's of London, the world's most powerful insurance market. In that speech, Carney argued that climate change wasn't just an environmental issue. It was, in his words, a systemic threat to global financial stability. He warned that fossil fuel assets held on corporate balance sheets could become what he called stranded assets, creating what he described as a carbon bubble capable of triggering a 2008-style financial collapse. And then he said something that I want you to pay very close attention to. He told the room, a room full of the world's most powerful financiers, that financing the decarbonization of the economy is a major opportunity for insurers as long-term investors. Did you catch that? He framed climate risk as catastrophe. And then in the same breath, how he told the room full of financiers, this is your opportunity to make a fortune. That's not environmentalism. That's a business pitch dressed up as a warning. After that 2015 speech, Carney didn't slow down. He accelerated. In 2021, he became the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. And in that role, he co-founded something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. At its peak, GFANZ represented over 450 of the world's largest financial institutions, with a combined $130 trillion in assets. $130 trillion. That is more money than the entire global GDP. And the commitment those institutions made to align their investments, your pension funds, your retirement accounts, your mortgages, with a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050. This wasn't government legislation. No parliament voted on it. No citizen approved it. It was a private financial architecture designed to redirect the global economy, built by one unelected banker. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. By 2023 and 2024, GFANZ started falling apart. Major American banks, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, all quietly pulled out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Why? Because the free market looked at the numbers, ran the models, and decided the math doesn't work. The private capital that Carney spent years trying to mobilize looked at the actual returns on green energy investments, and they walked away. So what does a man do when the world's largest financial institutions reject the system he spent a decade building? He runs for prime minister of the country he grew up in and builds it by law instead. Let me explain something called carbon contracts for difference, or CFDs, because this is the mechanism Carney just got Alberta to sign on to, and almost nobody is explaining what it actually means. Here's the simple version. Normally, when a private company wants to invest in something risky, like building a carbon capture facility, they take on that risk themselves. If it fails, they lose money. Under Carney's carbon CFD system, Canadian taxpayers backstop that risk. Here's how it works. The government promises investors a guaranteed minimum carbon price. If the actual market carbon price falls below that guaranteed floor, which it has repeatedly, the government pays the difference, meaning you pay the difference. It is essentially a profit guarantee for green energy investors, funded by Canadian tax dollars, locked in by legally binding contracts. The private capital markets looked at net zero investment risk and said, we don't want it. And Carney's solution was, fine, I'll make taxpayers absorb the risk instead, and I'll call it climate policy. Now, to be clear, carbon capture technology does exist. And some economists do argue there is a legitimate role for government support in early-stage clean energy development. That is a fair debate to have. But the specific mechanism of binding taxpayers to guaranteed investor returns in a system the free market already rejected, that deserves serious public scrutiny. And it is getting almost none. Now let's talk about Alberta specifically, because what's happening there is extraordinary. Over the last decade, more than $500 billion in global investment capital that was headed for Canada's resource sector packed up and left. It went to Texas, it went to the Middle East, it went to Southeast Asia, to places that said, come build here, we won't punish you for it. That $500 billion wasn't just money, it was jobs. It was tax revenue that funds schools and hospitals. It was royalties that could have been reinvested in communities, gone. And at the federal level right now, there are reportedly over 500 economic development projects sitting in the federal impact assessment system, waiting, pending, delayed. Meanwhile, Germany, yes, Germany, built an entire LNG import terminal in 194 days, under 6.5 months, from scratch. Canada can't even get a permit approved in 14 years for the same type of project. And here's the part that should make every Canadian furious. The German terminal that was built in 194 days, it doesn't import Canadian gas. It imports American gas, because the United States can actually get these things permitted and built. We have the world's third largest proven oil reserves. We have natural gas resources that Europe desperately wants. And we are watching other countries sell to markets that should be ours. Let me put two stories next to each other, because I think together they tell you everything about where Canada is right now. Story one. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration is opening permanent offices inside Canada, not at the border crossing, inside the country, specifically to address drug trafficking networks that have moved their production and distribution infrastructure north of the border. Kash Patel confirmed in Senate testimony that drug traffickers responded to the hardening of the U.S. southern border by moving their operations to Canada, flying product directly into Alaska and across tribal lands. Canada has become, in the eyes of American law enforcement, a weak point in continental security. Story two. CN Rail, a railway company, has just pledged $100 million to fight homelessness across North America. Why is a railway company funding homeless shelters, Indigenous support services, and women's shelters? Because their senior VP said explicitly, the homelessness crisis has become so severe, it is spilling onto their critical infrastructure. Think about what that means. The crisis is so large, so visible, and so unaddressed by government that a private corporation whose job is to move freight is now stepping into what should be a core government function. And the federal government's response to all of this? Carbon capture, a new major projects office, an Alberta energy deal built around ESG compliance. I'm not saying these things are nothing. I'm saying look at the order of priorities. When foreign law enforcement has to set up shop inside your borders because you can't handle your own drug crisis, and when a railway company is funding your homeless shelters because the government isn't, something has gone seriously wrong. Former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss has publicly stated that Mark Carney was a central architect of the globalist financial framework that she blames for suppressing economic growth across Western nations. Now, you can agree or disagree with Liz Truss. That's fair, but consider this. While Carney was Bank of England governor from 2013 to 2020, he presided over an extended period of quantitative easing, essentially printing money, that many economists credit with making housing permanently unaffordable for an entire generation of British young people. The UK is still dealing with that housing crisis today. Then he left England, Then he went to Canada. The pattern that critics are pointing to is this: the same framework, high carbon compliance costs, ESG investment mandates, expansionary monetary policy that inflates asset prices while suppressing wages, has been applied across multiple Western nations. And in each case, the living standards for ordinary working people have declined while the investment class has done extremely well. Whether you call that a conspiracy or just a bad policy cluster that keeps getting recycled, that question is worth asking. And the fact that the man most associated with building that framework is now in charge of implementing it at the highest level of Canadian government as an elected official with a majority mandate should get more attention than it's getting. Look, I want to be honest with you about something before I wrap up. Not everything in this story is simple. Not every policy Carney has championed is entirely without merit. Carbon pricing in some form is supported by economists across the political spectrum. Some clean energy investment does create jobs, but the specific mechanisms matter, and the order of priorities matters even more. When you backstop private investor risk with public money in a system the free market already rejected, that's not climate policy. That's wealth transfer with a green label on it. When the DEA is opening offices in your country because your own institutions can't handle your own borders, that's a sovereignty failure, not a trade dispute. When a railway company is funding your homeless shelters, that's not corporate generosity. That's a government that has stopped doing its most basic job. Canada has extraordinary natural advantages, world-class resources, educated workforce, strategic geography, a trusted international reputation, or what's left of it. None of those advantages disappear, but they do get squandered. And right now, they are being squandered. If this video gave you something to think about, please share it. Not because I need the algorithm boost, but because these conversations need to happen beyond people who already agree with each other. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you disagree. I genuinely want to know what I'm missing. I'll see you in the next one.